Born into a rising European royal family, Princess Stephanie was destined for greatness. But instead, she married into a royal nightmare. Trapped in a loveless marriage, she lived a life of betrayal and sickness, resulting in her becoming infertile at just 22. Then, just 2 years later, a shocking incident would change the course of her life. Join me as we explore her story. Princess Stephanie Clotilde was born on the 21st of May, 1864, in the Palace of Laeken in the suburbs of Brussels in Belgium. Her father was Prince Leopold, heir to the Belgian throne and the son of King Leopold I, the very first ruler of Belgium since its independence in 1831. Just a year and a half after her birth, her grandfather died and her father became King Leopold II. To the world, he was revered as a powerful statesman who made Belgium matter on the global stage despite its small size. He filled the country with grand palaces and majestic civic buildings, cementing his reputation as a visionary ruler, but behind the glittering facade of his reign darkness lurked. Today, Leopold's legacy is one of horror. He turned the Congo into a private fief, ruling it with an iron fist and exploiting its people for profit. Under his reign, millions of Congolese were enslaved on the rubber plantations, suffering many atrocities. Tragically, these conditions combined with disease and famine led to a sharp decline in the Congolese population, so Stephanie's family's wealth was made in part from Congolese blood money. Stephanie's mother was Maria Henriette of Austria, a member of the royal house of Habsburg in Austria, a country which had ruled Belgium for most of the 18th century. She and Leopold had 4 children. Their first daughter, Louise, was born in 1858, followed by their only son, Leopold, in 1859. Nearly 5 years later, Stephanie was born. And 8 years after that they had their youngest daughter, Clementine. Despite all these children, the Belgian royal family's domestic life was far from happy. Their parents' marriage had been a purely political arrangement, and they had completely different interests and personalities. Over time, tensions grew, and Queen Maria Henriette increasingly distanced herself from her husband, spending much of the 1870s apart from him. This increased the rigid constraints of royal life, and in the coming years Stephanie was about to be swept into a far darker world than she could have ever imagined. Stephanie's early years were marked by tragedy. In January 1869, her world was shattered when her brother, the heir to the throne, passed away, plunging the royal household into mourning. Although just 4.5 years old, this tragedy left a deep mark on Stephanie and began the decline of her parents' marriage. Then in 1871, disaster struck again. Europe was still battling waves of deadly disease of typhus, smallpox, and the dreaded Blue Death, a nickname for cholera. And it wasn't long until an outbreak swept through Brussels. Stephanie, not yet 7, fell gravely ill with typhus. For weeks, she drifted between life and death, unconscious, feverish, and full of pain. Her family feared for the worst, but against all odds she survived. 3 years later, Stephanie's rigorous education began. She was taught a variety of subjects to a high level and was multilingual, though she was not coddled, and she and her sisters were taught by strict disciplinarians. From 1875 onward, Stephanie often found herself as the highest ranking female royal at court, her older sister Louise had married and left Brussels, while her mother was frequently absent from the capital. Then, in the winter of 1878, her fate was sealed. Barely a teenager, she was introduced to Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. Rudolph was 20, while Stephanie was just 14, but their meeting was no accident. This was a match in the making. Behind the scenes, negotiations were in full swing. The Austrians saw Stephanie as a suitable bride, one who could secure the succession by producing male heirs. The pressure was immense, and after prolonged discussions, the marriage was arranged. On May 10, 1881, just days before her 17th birthday, Stephanie and Rudolph were wed in a grand ceremony in Vienna, but beneath the glittering spectacle of royalty, dark clouds were already forming over their union. Married life was far from a fairy tale for Stephanie. There was no great love, no deep affection, only duty. At first, their relationship was cordial, even somewhat happy. But cracks soon appeared. Rudolph had a volatile personality, and Stephanie found herself trapped in the palace, constantly watched, with little freedom. Despite the strain, the marriage produced a daughter named Elizabeth Marie, born in September 1883. But instead of joy, Rudolph met the news with thinly veiled disappointment. While he had wanted a male heir for the empire, she would be their only child, and Stephanie's only offspring. By the mid-1880s, she was sterile, the cause her own husband Rudolph. Rudolph was not just an alcoholic, but a rampant philanderer, indulging in affairs with women across Vienna. He contracted numerous sexually transmitted diseases, and most historians agree that he likely passed both syphilis and gonorrhea to Stephanie, leaving her unable to have children at just 22. At first, doctors blamed peritonitis. Rudolph had kept his illness a secret, and by the time Stephanie learned the truth, it was too late. Betrayed and humiliated, she was consumed by resentment. She refused to share a bed with her husband, who stumbled home at dawn reeking of liquor and other women. Meanwhile, Rudolph, drowning in his own misery, spiraled deeper into debauchery. By the late 1880s, it was common knowledge at court that Stephanie would never have another child. Rudolph's affairs carried on as if nothing had changed, and the worst was yet to come. From among Rudolph's many mistresses, one became very prominent. This was Baroness Mary Wetzira. In 1888, at just 17 years old, she became involved with the 30-year-old Crown Prince. During this time, Rudolph's behavior grew even more erratic, possibly due to his worsening syphilis. He and Wetzira began spending much of their time at Mayerling, a secluded hunting lodge near Vienna that Rudolph had bought and turned into a private retreat from the imperial court. On the 30th of January, 1889, Stephanie received shocking news. That morning, her husband, Crown Prince Rudolph, and Mary Wetzira were found dead at Mayerling. The Mayerling incident, as it has become known, led to an investigation and rumors of conspiracy. Assassination and even political intrigue swelled for years. But in the end, the truth was grim. Rudolph shot his mistress and then took his own life. Thus, at just 24 years old, Stephanie was a widow and unable to have any further children. Curiously, in the letter which he left for her, Rudolph expressed some affection. though there is no doubt that his impact on her life was terrible in many ways. After Rudolph's death, Stephanie hoped to return home to Belgium, but there was one problem. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, was still a Habsburg princess, and the imperial court refused to let her leave Vienna. Stephanie, now the dowager crown princess, was stuck in a city where she was unwanted. Her in-laws turned their backs on her and viewed her presence as a painful reminder of what had happened with Rudolph. During this lonely time, she found comfort in a romance with Count Arthur Potocki, a Polish nobleman who had stood by her through the darkest days. But fate struck again. Potocki, still under 40, suffered from lingual cancer. A failed surgery left him unable to speak, and by March 1890 he was dead. Stephanie, still grieving Rudolph's violent end, was once again plunged into mourning. To escape her sorrows, she traveled extensively, drifting through the Mediterranean, Malta, Tunisia, Sicily, Corfu, and beyond, searching for distraction, relief, or perhaps a new beginning. Still young and able to remarry, King Leopold II had grand plans. He wanted Stephanie to marry the new heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but that match never happened. Instead, by the late 1890s, Stephanie found love with Count Elmer Elamne, a Hungarian aristocrat. This was no political alliance. This was a marriage of affection, and Elmer even converted to Roman Catholicism, hoping to win King Leopold's approval. It didn't work. In a fierce letter, her father flatly refused to sanction the marriage. He would not allow his daughter to marry beneath her station. Despite this, Stephanie defied her father, and on March 27, 1900, she married Elmer at Miramare Castle near Trieste, losing her imperial titles in the process. Throughout these years, continued family disputes were emerging back in Belgium. Stephanie's father was growing old, and without a surviving direct male, heir plans were put in place for his nephew, Prince Albert, to succeed as King Albert I. Leopold had long been furious with his daughters for marrying beneath their station, and had all but disowned them. His resentment ran so deep that he forbade Stephanie from attending her mother's funeral in 1902 and refused to see her before his death. After Leopold's death in 1909, his daughters expected to inherit a share of his immense fortune. Instead, they discovered something quite shocking. He left most of his wealth through Caroline Lacroix, his much younger mistress, whom he had secretly married just 5 days before his death. Enraged, Stephanie and her sisters launched a fierce legal battle that dragged on for 5 years. In the end, Stephanie managed to secure a settlement of 5 million francs. In the summer of 1914, while on a state visit to Sarajevo, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man Stephanie's father once hoped she would marry, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. His death triggered a crisis that quickly spiraled into the First World War. Just weeks later, Germany invaded Belgium despite its neutrality, and Stephanie's homeland remained under German occupation for the next 4 years. As Austria, Hungary was allied with Germany in the war. Stephanie found herself in an uncomfortable position, living in the empire that was helping to occupy her homeland. Moreover, she'd become convinced that Emperor Franz Joseph had been in some way involved in the assassination of his heir, Franz Ferdinand. Luckily, by then she and Elmer were far from Vienna. In 1906, they'd settled at Rudolph's mansion in what is now Slovakia, one of the few places untouched by the war. There Stephanie dedicated herself to charitable work, finding purpose in a world unraveling around her. When Emperor Franz Joseph died in 1916, Stephanie and Elmer returned to Vienna for both his funeral and the coronation celebrations of the new ruler. Just 2 months later, Elmer was made a prince within the Hungarian aristocracy, but their world soon crumbled. In October 1918, Hungary lost the war and collapsed into separate nations. While most Habsburg royals were exiled, Stephanie and Elmer were spared. They remained at Rudolph's mansion, though they continued to travel frequently and had a happy union. Stephanie and Elmer lived a quiet life after the First World War. By then, she was also a grandmother, as her daughter had given birth to several children in the early 1900s. However, the relationship between Stephanie and her daughter became strained in the early 1920s. This was on account of Elizabeth Marie's personal life and her politics. She was a socialist and became known in Austria as the Red Archduchess. After a final falling out in 1924, Stephanie and her daughter Elizabeth Marie seemed to have cut ties completely, never speaking again. During these years, Stephanie composed her memoirs, published in 1935 and in English in 1937 under the title I Was to Be Empress. However, it was not a full autobiography, as she barely mentioned the half-century that followed Rudolph's death. Instead, the book was divided into 4 parts, with the final section titled Tragedy Mayerling. It was clear that her story, at least the one she chose to tell, ended in 1889. Perhaps her publishers knew that this was the version readers wanted. Or maybe she simply didn't want to share the details of her private life. Since that fateful day in September, Stephanie and Elmer lived a quiet life after the First World War. 1939, the Second World War broke out. Stephanie and her husband didn't live near the front lines, and the bordering countries were spared the worst of the fighting. Yet towards the end of it, the couple were troubled by plans the Nazis drew up to convert Rudolph's into a field hospital. As the Soviet Red Army advanced into Central Europe, when the Russians arrived there in the late spring of 1945, Stephanie and Elmer took refuge at the Pannonhalma Archabbey. She died there on the 23rd of August, 1945 at 81 years of age. She had disinherited her daughter a year earlier, and Elizabeth Marie did not attend Stephanie's funeral. She was buried in the Archabbey's crypt, and Elmer, who died just under a year later, was buried next to her. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching this video on Princess Stephanie of Belgium. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of life down below in the comments. And if you have any suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys found this interesting, and I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten.